Chapter 1. The Ash of Empires. My kingdom is dying, and I can feel every single leaf that turns to ash. I stood on the jagged edge of the Black Ridge. The world below was a graveyard of scorched earth and weeping shadows. The rot moved like a slow, oily tide, eating the green, choking the air, and leaving nothing but gray bone in its wake. As the wind shifted, the smell of burnt pine and old death clawed at my throat. My chest ached. A sharp, cold throb pulsed deep in my ribs, because my life force was tethered to this soil. I was the Alpha King, the High Protector, but I was a dam with too many leaks. Truth be told, I was failing. Without the Silent One promised by the scrolls, I was just a man watching his funeral pyre burn. "Sire!" a voice rasped behind me. It was Kyle, my commander. He looked as tired as I felt. After that, he stepped into the light. His armor was coated in the fine black soot that now rained from the sky like a curse. "The Silver Moon Pack," Kale said, his voice low. "They are holding their lunar ball tonight. They drink and dance while the southern glades shrivel into dust." I didn't turn around. Still, the growl in my chest was audible, a low, rumbling vibration that matched the tremors in the earth. They celebrate their wolf ranks while the world ends? They obsess over who shifted first, who shifted strongest, and they forget their ancient blood debt. "They claim they have no mythic anchors left to give," Kale reminded me. "Then they lie," I snapped. My world tilted. A sudden wave of dizziness hit me as another acre of forest succumbed to the rot somewhere miles away. I felt the land scream, a silent psychic howl that ripped through my mind. At that moment, I knew. I could no longer wait for prophecy. I could no longer wait for a girl to wander out of the woods and save us. Moments later, I hopped onto my mount, a beast of muscle and frost. We ride for the silver moon, because if they will not pay the debt in loyalty, I will collect it in blood. What followed was a silent trek through the gray. We rode like ghosts through a world that had forgotten the sun. Deep down, I knew the truth. If I didn't find the anchor today, there would be no crown left to wear by morning. Chapter 2. The Heavy Hum. The silver moon borders were a joke. They were a pathetic display of posturing and perfume. As we crossed into their lands, the air changed. It became thick with the scent of roasted meat and expensive wine. Yet, beneath that artificial sweetness, I tasted the rot. It was here too, creeping under their manicured lawns, but they were too busy preening to notice. What's worse was the noise. The pack members were gathered in the courtyard, barking and boasting about their lineage. They looked at my frost-covered procession with fear, but also with a disgusting sort of curiosity. To make things worse, their alpha, Silas Vane, stepped forward with a smirk that made my claws itch. "King Malphas," Silas called out, his voice smooth as silk and twice as fake. "We didn't expect the crown to grace our little party. Are you here to judge our new shifters?" Next, I dismounted. My boots hit the ground with the finality of a gavel. The tension broke, or rather it coiled tight. "I am here for the debt, Silas. 4 generations of protection. 1 mythic anchor. Where is she?" Silas laughed, a dry, grating sound. "Mythics? Sire, we are a modern pack. We value speed and aggression. We don't have time for silent anomalies. In fact, we've just finished clearing out the dead weight." He gestured toward the servants' quarters. Instead of looking at the noble daughters he was trying to push toward me, my focus shifted. I felt it, clear as day. A low-frequency hum was vibrating through the soles of my boots. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a wolf. It was a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against my heart. "What is that?" I whispered. "What's what?" Silas asked, confused. Maybe it was fate. My eyes scanned the crowd, ignoring the beautiful women in their silk gowns. Beyond the lights, in the shadows near the kitchen, I saw a girl. She was covered in soot, her dress tattered, her head bowed as she scrubbed the stone steps. She looked like a ghost, broken, discarded, and utterly alone. But the hum was coming from her. She didn't know what scared her more, the soldiers or her own invisibility. No matter how hard she tried to blend into the stones, she was radiating a power so vast it made my bones ache. Why was she scrubbing floors? Why was she being mocked by the Omegas? That one, I pointed. Silas's face twisted in disgust. Her? That's just Elara. She's a defect. 20 years old and no shift. She's a shifted-less servant, a burden on our resources. Truth be told, we're exiling her at midnight. As if fate demanded it, the girl looked up. The moment our eyes locked, the air thickened. Her eyes weren't the yellow of a wolf. They were the deep, crushing blue of a mountain glacier. In that moment, my soul answered. The land beneath us sighed in relief. I realized the pack wasn't just blind, they were suicidal. They were throwing away the only thing that could stop the apocalypse. Chapter 3. The Queen of Ash. The lunar ball was in full swing inside the Great Hall, but for me, the music had stopped. I walked through the doors, and the crowd parted like a sea of grass before a storm. At the head of the room, Silas Vane stood on a dais, preening like a king he would never be. He was showing off his purest wolves, but my gaze was fixed on the corner where Elara stood, holding a tray of drinks. Look at them, Kyle murmured beside me. They mock her while they starve for magic. I watched as a high-ranking female accidentally tripped Elara. The tray shattered. The wine stained Elara's ragged hem. The hall erupted in cruel laughter. To make things worse, Silas didn't stop them. Rather, he joined in. Careful, little bird, Silas mocked from his throne. If you can't even carry a tray, how will you survive the woods once we cast you out? You have no wolf to protect you. You are nothing. As her wolf stirred, or rather, as the great white beneath her skin reacted, the temperature in the room plummeted. The wine on the floor froze into jagged red needles. The fire in the hearth turned a ghostly, brilliant white. Still, the pack was too stupid to see it. They thought it was a draft. They thought it was me. Deep down, she knew the truth. She was shaking, not with fear, but with the effort of holding back a flood. I could see the golden veins of starlight pulsing beneath the soot on her neck. It was beautiful, and it was lethal. Enough! I roared. The silence that followed was absolute. Every wolf in the room dropped to their knees, not out of respect, but because my aura forced them down like a physical weight. I marched across the hall, my cape of white fur trailing behind me like a blizzard. I didn't go to Silas. I didn't go to the Alpha. I stopped in front of the servant girl. Under the weight of his stare, she looked up, her breath caught and her voice trembled. Sire, I'll clean it up. Please, don't hurt me. Clean it up? I whispered. My heart ached. The space between us burned with a heat that didn't belong to this world. You are the one they have been waiting for. You are the anchor to the north. And these insects have been making you scrub their floors? Without thinking, I reached out. The moment our skin touched, the bond pulsed. A violent, searing golden light that blinded the room. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, the soot on her face vanished, replaced by a radiant, pearl-like glow. Silas! I turned, my voice echoing like a mountain collapse. You call her a defect? You call her a burden? She hasn't shifted, Silas stammered, his arrogance vanishing into pure terror. She hasn't shifted because your pack's blood is too thin to host a goddess, I declared. She isn't a wolf, Silas, she is the Great White, and as of this moment, she belongs to the crown. Before she could speak, I swept Elara into my arms. Her body moved on instinct, clinging to me as if I were the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. As the sky darkened outside, I felt her heart skip against mine. A beat later, I looked at the shocked faces of the pack. The debt is collected, I said, my voice cold as the grave. And God help you if I ever see any of you on my lands again. In the stillness that followed, I carried her out. We left the lights, the wine, and the laughter behind. As we stepped into the frost carriage, the wind carried her name. Elara. My soul answered. She didn't know what lay ahead, but as the carriage began to move, her soul answered mine with a tentative, freezing heat. The war for the world had just found its heart, and I had finally found my reason to fight. Chapter 4. The Ripping of the Veil. The horizon was no longer white. It was a bruised, sickly purple. I stood upon the high ramparts of the citadel, my fingers digging into the frozen stone until it shriveled under my touch. Below, the valley was choked with the advancing army of the United Packs. At their head rode Silas Vane, but he wasn't just bringing soldiers. He was dragging the rot with him. A massive, swirling cloud of black ash and necrotic smoke followed his cavalry, acting as a living wall of death that wilted the very air. "He's using the decay as a weapon," Kyle spat, his hand white on the hilt of his sword. "The coward. He knows our wolves can't breathe that filth." "He doesn't realize that I am the only thing keeping that filth from swallowing his own lungs," I growled. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, aching rhythm, because I was already feeding the land my life force. Every step the rot took closer to my walls felt like a hot iron pressed against my skin. Soon after, a parley flag was raised. Silas rode forward alone, stopping just outside the range of our archers. He looked up, his face twisted into that same arrogant mask. "Malphas!" he bellowed, his voice amplified by pack magic. "Return the girl! Return the stolen property of the Silver Moon, and we will let your glacier stand. Refuse, and we will watch the rot turn your throne to dust." Next, I felt a presence beside me. Elara had climbed the stairs, her face pale but her eyes burning with a cold fire I hadn't seen before. She looked down at the man who had treated her like a servant for 20 years. At that moment, the pressure in the air spiked. The atmosphere began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that made the stones beneath our feet groan. "He thinks I am a prize to be traded," Elara whispered. Her voice was steady, but I could feel the storm brewing inside her. "You are the flame that will burn his world down if he steps 1 foot closer," I replied. Still, I felt a cold dread in my stomach. Silas wasn't just here for a fight. He was here to provoke a shift he thought she couldn't handle. What followed was a moment of pure, calculated malice. Silas raised a hand, and his mages unleashed a concentrated burst of the rot toward our gates. The black smoke hit our magical wards, and the scream of dying magic filled the air. My knees buckled. A cough of blood escaped my lips as the ward, tied to my own life, began to fail. "Malphas!" Elara cried, catching me before I could fall. Before I could move, she looked back at the army. Something inside her shifted. It wasn't the Great White. Not yet. But it was the first crack in the dam. The sky darkened as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of ancient ozone and the promise of a winter that would never end. Chapter 5. The Royal Surrender. The gates didn't just open. They exploded outward in a shower of ice and steel. I marched out into the snow, my armor hissing as the rot tried to eat through the frost. Behind me, Elara walked with a dignity that made the surrounding soldiers hesitate. Truth be told, I was a dying king leading a dormant goddess into a slaughterhouse, and I knew the odds. "Stop," I commanded, my voice echoing through the valley. Silas smirked, his wolf eyes glowing with greed. Finally, the king comes to surrender his toy. "I do not surrender," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am here to show you exactly what you threw away." Without another word, I did the unthinkable. In front of the entire United Pack army, in front of the men who called me the most powerful being in existence, I dropped to both knees. I bowed my head until my forehead touched the frozen ground at Elara's feet. A beat later, the valley went silent. The soldiers stared. Silas's jaw dropped. The Alpha King, the ruler of the North, was prostrating himself before a servant. "Elara Vance," I murmured, my voice vibrating against the earth. "The debt is paid. The crown is yours. The land is yours. Wake up. Because of my submission, the last barrier in Elara's mind finally shattered. She realized that she wasn't a burden. She wasn't a late bloomer. She was the destination. The great white in her soul recognized my surrender as the final key. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, the snow began to rise from the ground. It didn't fall. It levitated, swirling in a massive, shimmering cyclone around her. The rot smoke hit the edge of her aura and froze solid, falling to the ground like black glass. "No!" Silas screamed, realizing he had lost the narrative. "Kill her! She's a monster! She's stealing your magic!" Rather than retreating, Silas lunged forward, shifting into his massive gray wolf midair. He was a blur of fur and fury, his claws aimed directly for Elara's throat. She didn't move. She didn't even flinch. Just like that, the air thickened. Time stood still. Between one breath and the next, Elara's eyes turned a blinding, celestial white. A shockwave of pure frost erupted from her, knocking Silas back 100 feet. The sound wasn't a growl. It was the roar of an avalanche. Chapter 6: The Heart of the Storm. The battle was no longer a war. It was an execution of shadows. As the silence roared, Elara stood in the center of the chaos, her hair whipping around her like a halo of silver needles. The soldiers of the United Packs fell to their faces, not because I commanded it, but because the Great White demanded it. Their wolves were whimpering, tucking their tails in the presence of a primordial god. "Look at her!" I shouted, standing up as the strength flooded back into my limbs. My bond with her was pulsing like a second heart. "Look at the woman you called a burden." Still, Silas scrambled up from the snow, his wolf form limping and mangled. He was blinded by rage and the realization that his life was over. He tried to call his men to arms, but they wouldn't move. In fact, they were backing away, leaving him alone in the circle of Elara's frost. "You cheated!" Silas howled, shifting back into his human form, his face red and desperate. "You used forbidden magic to wake her. She belongs to the Silver Moon. She is my mate by pack law." What followed was a laugh from Elara that sounded like breaking ice. She stepped toward him, each footprint she left in the snow turning into a blooming flower of crystal. "I am nobody's property, Silas," she said. Her voice carried the weight of 1,000 winters. "And I am certainly not the mate of a coward who hides behind the rot." Without warning, the rot cloud that Silas had brought began to turn on him. Because Elara was now the dominant anchor for the land, the decay responded to her will. The black smoke began to coil around Silas's ankles like snakes. "Malphas, help me!" Silas screamed, his eyes wide with terror as the very darkness he worshipped began to pull him down. Truth be told, a part of me wanted to watch him disappear. But I looked at Elara and I saw the toll the power was taking. Her skin was turning translucent. The Great White was too big for her human heart. If she used her power to kill him in hate, it would consume her. "Elara, stop!" I lunged forward, grabbing her shoulders. The space between us burned. "Don't let him take your soul with him. He isn't worth the darkness." The moment their eyes locked, the world tilted. The white glow in her eyes softened, flickering back to the lake blue I loved. She gasped, the silver cyclone around us collapsing into a gentle snowfall. The rot smoke dissipated into harmless soot, leaving Silas shivering and broken in the mud. Moments later, Kale and the Citadel guards moved in, shackling the disgraced Alpha. The enemy army surrendered without a single drop of blood being shed. But as the tension broke, Elara's body went limp. "Malphas," she whispered, her voice fading. I caught her before she hit the ground, pulling her against my chest. Her heart was beating so slowly it terrified me. She had pushed back the rot, but the cost was her very life force. "I've got you," I promised, my tears freezing on my cheeks. "I've got you, my queen." Even so, as I carried her back toward the gates, I realized my claim had saved her life but destroyed her sense of reality. I was taking her to the Citadel to temper her, but I had just started a war with every pack in the world. I didn't know what scared me more, the armies that would come for us, or the fact that I was already willing to burn the world down just to see her wake up. Chapter 7. The Architecture of Despair. The Citadel of Frost didn't just house my people, it breathed with them. As we crossed the threshold of the inner sanctum, the walls of the living glacier hummed, a deep, resonant vibration that echoed the fragile state of the woman in my arms. I could feel the cold leaching into my own bones, but for the first time in centuries, I didn't welcome it. Elara's skin was so pale it was almost blue, and her pulse was a stuttering rhythm that threatened to stop with every heavy step I took. What followed was a frantic procession through the Hall of Ancestors. My advisors lined the path, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and naked greed. They didn't see the girl who had just nearly burned her soul out to save them. They saw a battery. They saw a solution to the rot. More importantly, they saw a vulnerability in me that they had never been able to exploit before. "Sire, she must be placed in the isolation chamber immediately," Valerius, the High Sage, insisted as he hurried beside me. "The Great White is unstable. If she wakes and loses control within these walls, the entire glacier will shatter." "She is not a weapon to be locked in a box, Valerius," I snarled. My voice cracked the frost on the nearby pillars. "She is the Queen of the North. You will prepare the solar suite. It is the only room that receives the direct light of the winter sun." Still, the submissiveness in the way the servants moved around us grated on my nerves. Elara was finally safe from Silas, yet she was entering a new kind of cage. By the time I laid her down on the bed of white furs, I felt the weight of my crown like a physical blow to the neck. I watched her face, waiting for a flicker of life, but she remained as still as a statue carved from snow. "I need a queen, Elara," I whispered into the freezing silence of the room. "Not a martyr. Wake up and show them you aren't just a vessel." Because of the magical feedback from the battle, my own strength was waning. I sat by her side, watching the light fade from the sky. Come morning, the packs would be regrouping, and my own advisors would be sharpening their tongues. I realized then that I had to protect her not just from the cold outside, but from the cold hearts of the people I called my own. Chapter 8. The Glow in the Dark. 2 days passed before her eyes finally fluttered open. In that moment, the air in the room didn't just warm, it sparkled. Tiny crystals of light danced in the air like diamond dust. I was standing by the window, watching the black line of the rot across the distant valley when I heard her first soft gasp. "Malphas?" Her voice was a ghost of a sound. Next, I was at her side. I didn't think. I reached out and took her hand. The space between us burned with a sudden, searing intensity. Her skin was no longer cold. It was radiating a gentle, internal heat that made the frost on my own armor melt into tears of water. "You're awake," I breathed. My heart skipped a beat as her fingers curled around mine. "The Great White, it didn't consume you. It felt like the ocean was trying to fit inside a cup," she murmured. She looked around the room, her eyes widening at the opulence of the ice-carved furniture and the glowing tapestries. "The Citadel, it's so beautiful. But I feel like I'm still a servant here, Malphas. Everyone looks at me like I'm a ghost." Truth be told, she wasn't wrong. I could hear the whispers of the guards outside the door. They were afraid of her. Rather than lying to her, I decided it was time for the first tempering. I needed her to understand that her power wasn't a curse. It was her voice. "Come," I said, helping her stand. "I want to show you the heart of the glacier." What's worse than the fear of the packs was the fear of her own potential. I led her deep into the bowels of the fortress, to the cavern where the primary ley lines of the north intersected. In the center was a pedestal of raw, unrefined crystal. "Touch it," I commanded. She hesitated, her body moving on instinct as she backed away. "I'll break it. I'll break everything." You won't, I said, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative rumble. Because I am here to hold the ground beneath you. As the silence roared, she finally reached out. The moment her fingertips brushed the crystal, the entire cavern erupted in a soft golden glow. The ice didn't shatter. It began to grow, weaving itself into intricate, blooming flowers of light. I realized then that she was far more dangerous than the scrolls predicted, not because of her destruction, but because of her creation. She was bringing life back to a dead world. Chapter 9. The Borders Breach. The peace was shattered by the sound of iron bells tolling from the high towers. Without thinking, I pulled Elara behind me, my claws extending as my wolf senses surged to the surface. A border skirmish had broken out. Silas's remnants weren't retreating. They were testing our gates, emboldened by the rumors that I had spent the last 48 hours at a servant's bedside. Stay here, I ordered Elara. The wards in this room are the strongest in the Citadel. Do not leave, no matter what you hear. Malphas, wait, she started. But I was already gone. What followed was a brutal hour of steel and fur. I stood at the front lines, my breath coming in ragged plumes of frost as I tore through the scouts of the United Packs. They were desperate, driven by the hunger of the rot that was now eating their own lands. I fought like a man possessed, because I knew that if I fell, Elara was the only thing left for them to devour. Eventually, the enemy retreated into the shadows of the gray woods. I returned to the Citadel, bloodied and exhausted, my cape shredded and my ribs aching. But when I reached the solar suite, the guards were gone. Elara? I roared, my voice echoing through the empty hall. I found her in the courtyard, surrounded by 3 of my high advisors. They were looming over her, their voices sharp and demanding. They were trying to force her to sign a decree, a document that would officially hand over her care to the Sage Council for scientific study. She is a guest of the crown, I bellowed, stepping between them. My scent was thick with the copper tang of blood and the ozone of rage. She is a resource, Malphas, Valerius countered, his eyes flashing with defiance. You are compromised. You are protecting the girl and letting the kingdom bleed at the gates. At that moment, her soul answered. Elara stepped forward, her hand resting on my blood-stained arm. She didn't look like a servant anymore. The air thickened, and a thin layer of frost began to climb up Valerius's boots, pinning him to the spot. The king protects the north, she said, her voice echoing with the power of the Great White. And I protect the king. Leave us. Without another word, the advisors scrambled away, their faces pale with terror. I looked down at Elara, savoring the solid, real presence of her. She had found her teeth. Yet, as the wind carried the distant scent of more approaching wolves, I realized the cost of our connection. I had to protect her from my own world, but in doing so, I was becoming the very tyrant she feared. And just like that, the space between us burned with a new kind of intensity. Not just duty, but desire. Malphas. They call me a king of ice, but standing here watching the rot consume the only world I've ever known, I feel like a beggar. I have spent centuries guarding a throne that is melting beneath me. I have everything, and yet I have nothing. Until I found her. Elara, the girl they called broken. The girl the packs threw away like ash in the wind. They don't see the starlight trapped in her veins. But I do. I feel it, clear as day, vibrating against my own dying heart. The war is coming. Silas and his army of shadows are at the gates, and they aren't just coming for my crown. They are coming for her. And let me be clear, I will burn this entire world to the ground before I let them touch a single hair on her head. But I can't fight this battle in the dark. Chapter 10. The Echo of Loneliness. The friction between duty and desire was a spark in a room full of gunpowder. I tried to maintain the distance, because I was a king and she was a miracle. But the walls of the Citadel felt smaller every day. I brought her to the high balcony for her next lesson, intending to teach her how to command the frost. Instead, I found myself watching the way the wind caught her hair. Close your eyes, I murmured, stepping behind her. My body moved on instinct, my chest nearly brushing her back as I reached around to guide her hands toward the open air. The air thickened, the smell of falling snow and her unique sweet scent, like wild honey and ozone, swirled together. I felt her heart skip, a rapid drumming against her ribs that mirrored my own. Don't just watch the cold, Elara. Feel the static in the air. That is your power looking for a target. Without thinking, my hands closed over hers. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, a massive surge of magical feedback ripped through both of us. It wasn't just energy, it was an emotional bridge. In that moment, her world tilted, and I felt it, the crushing weight of her years of loneliness. I saw the dark kitchen corners, the sting of the lash, and the silence that had been her only friend. Malphas, she gasped, her voice trembling as she leaned back into me. The space between us burned with a hunger that had nothing to do with the Great White. I saw the vulnerability in her eyes, and for the first time, my duty to the crown felt like a leaden weight I wanted to hurl off the cliff. I wanted to be just a man, just her mate. But then, the space between us cracked as a horn blasted from the valley floor. The spell was broken. I pulled away, my breath coming in ragged plumes, my skin still tingling where her warmth had met my frost. Chapter 11. The Diplomat's Venom. What followed was a nightmare dressed in silk. Silas Vane did not return with an army this time. He arrived with a white flag and a retinue of elders from the United Pacts. Because of the ancient laws of parley, I was forced to open the gates. I stood on my throne, my hand white-knuckled on the armrest as Silas marched into the Great Hall with a sickeningly sweet smile on his face. "I am here as a diplomat, King Malphas," Silas declared, bowing with an indulgent condescension that made my wolf snarl. "The Pacts are concerned. They see you've taken a servant and turned her into a prisoner of the ice." "She is no prisoner," I said, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Isn't she?" Silas turned his gaze toward Elara, who sat on a smaller chair beside me. "Tell me, Elara, has he told you what happens after you shift? Has he told you that the Great White isn't a gift, but a battery? He's just fattening you up for the slaughter, waiting for the day he can drain your soul to patch his leaking kingdom." Not only that, but Silas began to weave a web of lies about my father. He spoke of how the previous king had searched for a Great White only to use her, until there was nothing left but a husk. I saw the light in Elara's soul dim. I saw the doubt cloud those beautiful lake blue eyes. "Is it true?" she whispered, looking at me. "Am I just an asset to be managed, Malphas?" Truth be told, the question cut deeper than any blade. I wanted to roar the truth, that I loved her, but the eyes of the advisors were on me. If I showed weakness now, Silas would use it to incite a coup. I remained silent, my face a mask of cold stone. "We are here to offer her asylum," Silas continued, his voice breezy and confident. "A neutral pack where she won't be a weapon. Or is the king too protective to let his battery go?" As the silence stretched, I realized I was losing her. Silas was gaslighting her with the precision of a surgeon, and I was trapped by my own crown. Chapter 12. The tyrant's shadow that night. The shadows danced between us like ghosts of things unsaid. I found Silas in the secondary courtyard, smoking a pipe and looking up at my citadel as if he already owned the deed. "You think you're clever," I said, stepping out of the darkness. My scent was a predatory intensity that should have sent him running. "I think I'm winning," Silas smirked. "She doesn't trust you, Malphas. She sees the way you look at her power, and she's starting to realize that the High Protector is just a fancy name for a jailer." Without warning, my body moved on instinct. I had his throat in my hand before he could even blink. I slammed him against the frozen stone wall, the impact cracking the ice. A growl rose in my throat, deep and primal, as I felt the urge to shift and tear his lying tongue from his mouth. "I could kill you right here," I hissed, my eyes glowing a lethal gold. I could freeze your lungs until they shatter like glass. Do it, Silas gasped, a mocking grin on his face. Prove to her that you're exactly the monster I said you were. Show her how the king handles diplomacy. Before the words left his lips, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see Elara standing in the archway, her face a mask of horror. She didn't see a protector. She saw a tyrant nearly murdering a guest in the dark. Moments later, I let go of Silas. He slumped to the ground, coughing and laughing, knowing he had won this round. Elara didn't say a word. She simply turned and ran back toward the solar suite. In the quiet that followed, I stood alone in the cold. I was trapped. If I acted like a king, I was a monster. If I acted like a lover, I was a failure. Deep down, I knew the truth. Silas hadn't brought an army because he didn't need one. He was destroying us from the inside out, and I didn't know how to stop the rot in my own heart. Chapter 13. The Brittle Truth. The moon was a cold silver eye watching the decay of my world. I found Elara in the solar suite, staring out at the glacier with a hollow look that haunted me. The silence between us wasn't peaceful. It was a wall of glass, thin and ready to shatter. No matter how hard she tried to hide it, I could see her hands shaking beneath her silk sleeves. "He told you I was fattening you for the slaughter," I said, my voice cracking the stillness like a footstep on thin ice. "He told me I was a battery," she whispered, finally turning to face me. "And you didn't deny it, Malphas. You didn't say a word." Truth be told, I had no lies left to offer. I walked toward her, my shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor. "The fading crown isn't just a title, Elara. It's a death sentence. The land is drinking me dry because I have no anchor. If you don't shift, if the Great White doesn't fully wake, the rot will take this kingdom, and then it will take me." Her breath caught, her eyes widening as the truth unraveled. "So he was right. You need me to survive." "I need the Great White to save the North," I corrected, stepping into her personal space until the space between us burned. "But I need you, because I have forgotten how to breathe without hearing your heart in the next room. I am giving you a choice I never had. There is a carriage waiting at the postern gate. You can leave. You can run south, away from the ice, away from the prophecy, and away from me." As the silence roared, she looked at the door, then back at my face. She saw the desperation I had tried so hard to mask. Instead of running, she moved closer. Her body moved on instinct, her hand rising to touch the cold stubble on my jaw. "I spent 20 years being told I was nothing," she murmured. "But you knelt. You didn't kneel to a battery, you knelt to me. I'm staying, Malphas. Tell me what we have to do." Chapter 14. The Scream of the Ice. What followed was a descent into the deepest, darkest chamber of the Citadel, the Soul Forge. It was a room where the temperature was so low that even my breath felt like shards of glass in my lungs. This was where the final ritual began. To trigger the Great Shift, Elara had to endure a magical burn, a process of stripping away her human limitations to let the deity out. "I have to hold you," I said, my voice thick with a fear I had never felt in battle. "If I don't provide a physical ground for the energy, you will ignite from the inside out." Next, I pulled her into my arms, my back against the central altar of raw diamond. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, the ritual ignited. It wasn't a gentle glow. It was a violent, white-hot eruption of power. Elara threw her head back, a scream ripping through her throat that sounded like the earth itself was splitting open. "Malphas!" she shrieked, her fingers clawing into my leather armor. Her body was vibrating with such force I thought my own bones would snap. I had to stay cold. I had to channel every ounce of my glacial power into her to keep her heart from melting. But deep down she knew the truth. My heart was breaking with every agonized sob she drew. Because I loved her, every spark of her pain felt like a brand on my own soul. "Hold on!" I roared over the howling magical wind. "Don't let go of me! Look at me, Elara!" But then, The air thickened with the smell of ozone and something sour, the rot. The energy was so bright it was blinding, a celestial white that turned the shadows into jagged knives. I felt her spirit stretching, expanding, becoming something ancient and terrifying. In that moment, I realized I would rather the kingdom fall. I would rather die in the ash than see her endure another second of this torture. Chapter 15. The Black Vane. To make things worse, the sabotage hit when we were at our most vulnerable. A massive explosion rocked the soul forge, the sound of stone grinding against stone echoing from above. Silas hadn't left. He had used his diplomatic access to plant rot bombs within the thermal wards of the citadel. The words... I gasped, feeling my connection to the fortress snap. They're gone. Without the wards to contain the ritual, the rot flooded into the room like black ink in a basin of water. I saw it, clear as day, creeping across the floor, turning the beautiful blue ice into gray sludge. Before I could move to shield her, a tendril of the black smoke lashed out, catching Elara's ankle. "No!" I screamed. The moment the rot touched her skin, her white glow flickered. The black veins climbed up her leg, a necrotic poison that fought the purity of the great white. Elara's eyes went dull, her head lolling back against my shoulder as the magical agony turned into a deathly cold. "Malphas," she whispered, her voice fading as the darkness claimed her. What's worse than the pain was the silence that followed. The ritual stopped. The light died. I was left in the dark, clutching her limp body as the citadel began to groan and melt around us. The heat of the rot was winning. As the silence roared, I looked down at the black veins on her throat and felt a fury so cold it turned my blood to ice. She was gone. Or so it seemed. I held her against my chest, my voice trembling as I whispered her name into the dark. But there was no answer. Just like that, everything changed. I wasn't just a king anymore, I was a man sitting in the ruins of his heart, waiting for the shadows to finish what they started. Chapter 16. The Melting Crown. The citadel was weeping. I could hear it in the heavy, rhythmic thump of melting ice hitting the marble floors. As the silence roared, I sat on the freezing stones of the soul forge, cradling Elara's body against my chest. The black veins of the rot had climbed her throat, tracing a map of death across her porcelain skin. I didn't know what scared her more, the pain or the darkness. But now, she was beyond fear. She was simply gone. "Wake up," I whispered, my voice breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. "Elara, please. You stayed. You chose me. You can't leave me with this crown." Next, I closed my eyes and tried to force my own life force into her. I channeled every spark of my kingly magic, trying to jumpstart her heart, but I was too weak. The sabotage had drained me. The rot was an anchor dragging us both into the abyss. Because I had tethered my soul to the land, and the land was dying, I was becoming a hollow shell. My world tilted as a wave of nausea hit me, but I didn't let go. I couldn't. What followed was a frantic intrusion. Kyle burst into the chamber, his face streaked with soot and blood. "Sire, the thermal wards are completely gone. The rot is eating through the lower levels. The advisors, they're fleeing. They say the Great White is a curse." "Let them run," I growled, though it sounded more like a whimper. "Malphas, listen to me." Kyle grabbed my shoulder, shaking me. "Silas's army has reached the gates. They aren't just wolves anymore. They're husks, driven by the rot. If you don't lead the defense, there won't be a citadel left to protect her." Still, I didn't move. I looked at Elara's pale face and realized I had failed as a king and as a mate. I had spent my life trying to control the flood, but I had let the only light I ever loved drown right in front of me. Truth be told, I didn't care about the gates. I didn't care about the throne. "Go, Kyle," I said, my voice dead. "Lead them. If the North falls tonight, let it fall. I am not leaving her side." Chapter 17. The Whisper in the Void. That night, the citadel became a tomb. I carried Elara back to the solar suite, even though the room was no longer warm. The sun had disappeared behind a thick, oily shroud of black smoke. I laid her on the furs and sat on the floor, my hand never leaving hers. I watched the black veins on her skin pulse with a sickly light. "You were right, Silas," I murmured to the empty room. I was a jailer. I was so afraid of the rot that I forgot to cherish the soul I was supposed to anchor. In fact, the silence was so heavy it felt like it was crushing my lungs. I began to tell her stories, not of kings or wars, but of the things I had never told anyone. I told her about the first time I saw a flower bloom in the frost. I told her about the secret fear I had that I was just a monster with a crown. Before she could move, before she could answer, I leaned down and pressed my forehead to hers. "I don't want the great white Elara," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't want the savior. I just want the girl who looked at me in the kitchen and didn't bow. I just want you." But then, a distant crash echoed through the halls. The gates had been breached. I could hear the snarling of rotwolves and the screams of my men. My instincts surged. My wolf wanted to hunt, to kill, to protect the door. Yet, my heart held me still. I was trapped between the warrior I was born to be and the man she had made me. "Forgive me," I said, kissing her cold knuckles. I stood up, my bones aching, and drew my sword. The blade shimmered with a weak, flickering frost. I prepared to go out and die defending her door because even if she never woke up, her body would be the last thing I ever lost. Chapter 18. The Point of Total Loss. The air thickened as the smell of decay reached the solar suite. I stood in the doorway, my shadow stretching out into the hall where the first of Silas's husks were appearing. They were twisted things, their fur falling out in patches, their eyes glowing with a mindless purple hunger. "Malphas!" Silas's voice echoed through the corridor, laughing and distorted. "Step aside. Give me the girl and I might let you die quickly." What's worse than the enemy was the realization that my own people had abandoned me. As the silence roared, I looked back at Elara one last time. She looked so peaceful, so still. Just like that, the space between us burned with a final desperate spark of the bond. I felt a tiny microscopic twitch in her fingers. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was the sheer force of my grief. But the bond pulsed, just once, not with power, but with a question. "Do you see me?" "I see you," I whispered. Without thinking, I turned back to the hallway and let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the melting castle. I lunged, a blur of fur and fury, into the mass of rotwolves. I fought like a man who had already accepted his death. I tore through them, my claws dripping with black ichor. But there were too many. Eventually, they forced me back. I was covered in wounds, my blood staining the white marble. Silas stepped over the bodies of his own men, a blade of blackened steel in his hand. He looked past me toward the bed where Elara lay. "A waste," Silas sneered, "but her blood will still anchor my new world." Before he could move, a sudden, blinding light erupted from the room behind me. It wasn't the white of the glacier. It was a searing, celestial silver that made the shadows scream. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted until the air itself turned to liquid. In that moment, everything changed. I felt it, clear as day. The great white hadn't left. She had been waiting for the rot to find the one place it couldn't survive, the very center of her heart. Chapter 19. The Breath of the Galaxy. The light didn't just illuminate the room. It erased the darkness with the violence of a collapsing star. I was thrown to my shattered knees, my eyes burning as the celestial silver scorched the retinas of every rotwolf in the corridor. Silas screamed, clutching his face as his blackened blade shattered into 1,000 useless shards of glass. As the silence roared, a sound emerged from the solar suite, a low, rhythmic thrumming that matched the heartbeat of the universe itself. It wasn't the sound of a girl waking up. It was the sound of a world being reborn. I turned my head, squinting through the brilliance, and saw Elara standing in the center of the room. She was levitating inches off the firs, her hair a wild, silver mane of static and starlight. Malphas. Her voice didn't come from her lips. It echoed directly in my mind, ancient and resonant. Elara, I choked out, my blood-stained hands reaching for her. Next, the black veins on her skin began to turn silver. The rot wasn't just being pushed back, it was being converted. The necrotic poison was being transmuted into pure, raw energy. She looked at me, and her eyes were no longer lake blue. They were windows into a nebula. Truth be told, I had never seen anything so terrifyingly beautiful. I see the path, Malphas, she whispered, her body glowing with such intensity that the melting walls of the citadel began to refreeze instantly. But we have to draw them in, all of them. The rot must be lured to the core if I am to purge it from the land. What followed was a moment of absolute trust. She was asking me to let the enemy win, to let Silas and his army of husks into the very heart of my kingdom. It looked like surrender. It felt like madness. But as our eyes locked, I saw the woman I had knelt for. I am your blade, Elara, I vowed, my voice a growl of renewed strength. Tell me where to stand. Chapter 20. The Lure of the Glacier. What's worse than a losing battle is a fake retreat. I stood at the head of the great hall, my sword lowered, my armor cracked and dripping with my own blood. Behind me, Elara had vanished into the shadows of the Soul Forge. I watched as Silas and his remaining army of twisted, necrotic wolves poured through the gates, their laughter echoing off the refrozen rafters. Look at the Alpha King, Silas mocked, his face still red from the light burn but his eyes wide with greed. He stands in the ruins of his house and begs for mercy. The throne is yours, Silas, I said, my voice sounding hollow and defeated. The girl is in the core. She's too powerful for me to hold. Take her, if you think you can handle the weight. Because of his arrogance, Silas didn't hesitate. He gestured for his men to follow, their heavy paws thumping on the ice as they marched toward the Soul Forge. They moved like a plague of locusts, their presence turning the air sour and thick. I followed behind them, my heart hammer-thudding against my ribs. I was a king leading a wolf into a trap, and with every step he took toward the core, the air grew thinner. Soon after, we reached the heart of the glacier. The central pedestal of raw diamond was glowing with a faint, pulsing light. Silas stepped onto the platform, his chest puffed out as he looked around at the vast, crystalline cavern. Finally, he breathed, reaching out toward the light, the power to rewrite the world. Rather than grabbing a battery, he grabbed a lightning bolt. At that moment, I sent the telepathic signal. Now, Elara. Before Silas could move, the heavy iron doors of the forge slammed shut, fueled by a surge of my own remaining magic. The ground beneath our feet didn't just shake, it groaned as the ley lines of the north began to twist. Silas turned, his face pale as he realized the retreat was a noose. You think you can trap me here? Silas snarled, shifting into his mangled wolf form. I have the rot! I will eat this mountain from the inside out. Chapter 21. The Cracking of the World. As the wind shifted, the temperature in the Soul Forge dropped to a point where reality itself began to fracture. Elara stepped out from behind the central crystal, her skin shimmering like a pearl under moonlight. She didn't look afraid anymore. She looked like the judge, the jury, and the executioner. The rot doesn't belong to you, Silas, she said, her voice a calm, lethal whisper. It belongs to the earth, and the earth is calling it home. Just like that, she threw her arms wide. A shockwave of pure, absolute zero energy erupted from her core. It didn't hit Silas like a fist, it hit him like a law of nature. The black smoke coiled around his limbs was suddenly frozen mid-air, turning into brittle soot that crumbled into nothingness. No! Silas howled, his wolf form shrinking as the stolen power was ripped from his marrow. What followed was the sound I had been waiting for, the sound of cracking ice above us. I looked up and saw the ceiling of the soul forge begin to splinter. Elara wasn't just purging the rot, she was collapsing the corrupted layers of the glacier to bury the darkness forever. "Malphas, come to me," she cried, her hand reaching out through the silver storm. Her body moved on instinct as she pulled me toward the central pedestal, the only safe spot in the collapsing cavern. I lunged through the falling shards of ice, my fingers catching hers just as a massive slab of the ceiling came crashing down where Silas had been standing. "I've got you!" I roared, pulling her against my chest. In the span of a breath, the world turned white. The roar of the falling glacier drowned out the screams of the enemy. I held her as tight as I could, my back to the storm, my soul anchored to hers. I didn't know if we would survive the collapse, but as the silver light swallowed us whole, I realized that for the first time in my life I wasn't afraid of the end. Because of her, the silence wasn't a graveyard anymore. It was a beginning. Chapter 22. The Purity of the Great White. The silence that followed the collapse was not empty. It was heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I opened my eyes to a cathedral of fallen stars. The soul forge was gone, buried under 1,000,000 tons of ancient, purified ice, but we were standing in a pocket of shimmering light. Without warning, the air around us shattered. It wasn't the sound of stone breaking, but the sound of a soul expanding beyond the limits of the flesh. As if pulled by a string, I was forced back. I watched, my heart hammering against my ribs, as Elara's body began to dissolve into ribbons of blinding, ethereal silk. This was it. The great shift. It wasn't the bloody, bone-snapping agony of a common wolf. It was a transition of light and law. In the span of a breath, the girl I loved vanished, and in her place stood a creature of myth. She was a mountain of silver-white fur, her paws the size of shields and her eyes glowing with the cold, pure fire of the cosmos. The Great White. The moment their eyes locked, I felt a wave of peace so profound it nearly brought me to my knees. She didn't growl. She didn't snarl. Instead, she simply breathed. With every exhale, a pulse of silver light rippled outward, touching the gray, rot-stained walls of the citadel. What followed was a miracle. The black sludge of the rot didn't just disappear. It was bleached white. It turned into snow. Pure, soft, life-giving snow. She turned her massive head toward the shadows where the last of Silas's husks cowered. With a single glance, she didn't kill them. She unmade their hate. She froze the darkness in their hearts until they crumbled into dust, leaving only the original men behind, shivering and confused in the cold. Chapter 23. The Aftermath of Glory. Come morning, the sun broke over the horizon for the first time in months. It wasn't the weak, sickly light of a dying star, but a golden roar of triumph. I found her in the drifts outside the ruined gates. The Great White was gone, and Elara lay curled in the snow, human once more. Her body moved on instinct as she shivered, her skin pale but no longer translucent. Because the bond was now fully forged, I felt her before I saw her. I walked toward her, my heavy boots crunching on the first clean snow the North had seen in a decade. Without thinking, I stripped off my fur-lined cloak and wrapped it around her, pulling her into the heat of my chest. Is it over?" she whispered. Her voice was thin, but her eyes were clear. "The rot is gone, Elara," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't contain. Truth be told, I was weeping, the tears freezing into diamonds on my cheeks. "You saved us. You saved everything." Still, she looked toward the valley where the United Pack's army was beginning to wake up. They weren't an invading force anymore. They were broken people looking for a leader. Soon after, Kale and the remaining guards emerged from the rubble of the citadel. They didn't look at me with fear. They looked at Elara with a reverence that bordered on worship. Chapter 22. The Purity of the Great White. The silence that followed the collapse was not empty. It was heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I opened my eyes to a cathedral of fallen stars. The soul forge was gone, buried under 1,000,000 tons of ancient purified ice, but we were standing in a pocket of shimmering light. Without warning, the air around us shattered. It wasn't the sound of stone breaking, but the sound of a soul expanding beyond the limits of the flesh. As if pulled by a string, I was forced back. I watched, my heart hammering against my ribs, as Elara's body began to dissolve into ribbons of blinding, ethereal silk. This was it. The great shift. It wasn't the bloody, bone-snapping agony of a common wolf. It was a transition of light and law. In the span of a breath, the girl I loved vanished, and in her place stood a creature of myth. She was a mountain of silver-white fur, her paws the size of shields and her eyes glowing with the cold, pure fire of the cosmos. The Great White. The moment their eyes locked, I felt a wave of peace so profound it nearly brought me to my knees. She didn't growl. She didn't snarl. Instead, she simply breathed. With every exhale, a pulse of silver light rippled outward, touching the gray, rot-stained walls of the citadel. What followed was a miracle. The black sludge of the rot didn't just disappear. It was bleached white. It turned into snow. Pure, soft, life-giving snow. She turned her massive head toward the shadows where the last of Silas's husks cowered. With a single glance, she didn't kill them. She unmade their hate. She froze the darkness in their hearts until they crumbled into dust, leaving only the original men behind, shivering and confused in the cold. Chapter 23. The Aftermath of Glory. Come morning, the sun broke over the horizon for the first time in months. It wasn't the weak, sickly light of a dying star, but a golden roar of triumph. I found her in the drifts outside the ruined gates. The Great White was gone, and Elara lay curled in the snow, human once more. Her body moved on instinct as she shivered, her skin pale but no longer translucent. Because the bond was now fully forged, I felt her before I saw her. I walked toward her, my heavy boots crunching on the first clean snow the North had seen in a decade. Without thinking, I stripped off my fur-lined cloak and wrapped it around her, pulling her into the heat of my chest. Is it over?" she whispered. Her voice was thin, but her eyes were clear. "The rot is gone, Elara," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't contain. Truth be told, I was weeping, the tears freezing into diamonds on my cheeks. "You saved us. You saved everything." Still, she looked toward the valley where the United Pack's army was beginning to wake up. They weren't an invading force anymore. They were broken people looking for a leader. Soon after, Kyle and the remaining guards emerged from the rubble of the citadel. They didn't look at me with fear, they looked at Elara with a reverence that bordered on worship.